With me is Professor Alan Ford, who's a professor of theology and is very interested in the whole topic of apocalyptic in Ireland. Alan, why is apocalyptic in Ireland important? And begin by explaining apocalyptic.
We have a problem even pronouncing it. It's a very obscure term. It comes from the Greek. Academics always start with the Greek. Apocalypto, to uncover. And what it refers to is those passages in the Bible that seem to have hidden meanings. And if you can explain those hidden meanings, you reveal what God intended. It particularly refers to passages in Daniel, where he's referring to the four empires, in Thessalonians, where they refer to that man of sin, Antichrist, and to the whole of the book of Revelation, which, as those of you who've read it recently, though not many have, contains all those fascinating statements about the seven vials, the seven trumpets, the whore of Babylon, the beast, the conflict between the forces of righteousness and the overwhelming forces of Antichrist. There are various ways of interpreting the book of Revelation in history. The obvious way is to see them as a product of the time in which they were written, when the early Christians were being persecuted by the Romans, referring to then. The safest interpretation, and the most common one these days, is to see them as referring to some far distant time in the future, the end of time, when there'll be a battle between the forces of good and the forces of evil. And that's the interpretation of Augustine, which I think is the standard orthodox interpretation of most churches. But there's a much more, for me, exciting and dangerous and radical and terrifying way of interpreting it, which is to see the prophecies contained in the apocalyptic passages in the Bible as referring to now, as explaining what's happening in history now. The period I work in is the early modern period, the 16th and 17th centuries, the period of the Reformation and counter-Reformation. The Protestant churches then, almost universally, adopted a particularly presentist interpretation of Revelation, as I would term it. They saw Revelation as explaining what was happening in their particular time. The forces of good were the Protestant churches, small groups of people around Europe fighting a battle against the overwhelming forces of the Catholic Church. And they equated the Catholic Church with Antichrist. They identified specifically the popes with Antichrist. And they then went back historically and explored the way in which Antichrist had grown up in the papal church. Antichrist, according to the book of Revelation, had been bound for 1,000 years from the death of Christ till the early 11th century, and then had been released in the papacy. Since then, he'd been growing in power, and the popes had been basically corrupting the Catholic Church. The Reformation in the 1520s and 30s was the sixth trumpet, the opening of the sixth vial, whatever you wish, when the true Christianity was going to be restored back to its biblical purity, and ultimately the papacy overthrown by the Protestant churches. That, if you like, is the intellectual framework for apocalyptic in the early modern period. What different Protestant churches in different countries did was to apply that to their own particular experience. The French Huguenots obviously thought in terms of oppression. The Bartholomew Days massacre was an obvious example of Antichrist killing true Christians. The Armada in England was the Spanish Catholic Armada sailing against poor little England, the home of the gospel, and what happened was the winds of God blew the Armada askew and saved England. And in Ireland, we can see this being applied to the battles between Protestants and Catholics in Ireland. The first example of this comes from the 1579 rebellion of the Desmond Rebellion, when some Fitzgeralds returned to Ireland with a papal banner leading a small band of troops and began a 4-year rebellion. That was portrayed in Holinshed's Chronicles of Ireland, in the second edition of that, published in 1586. That was portrayed as, for the first time in Irish history, as not a battle between English and Irish for power, but as a battle between Christ and Antichrist, with the English forces representing the forces of Christ and the Catholic forces representing the forces of Antichrist. And the slaughter by Lord Deputy Grey of many of the Spanish soldiers after they surrendered in 1580 was seen as the destruction of the shavelings of Antichrist. In other words, it was legitimate to slaughter in cold blood soldiers who'd surrendered because they weren't people worthy of respect, they were followers of Antichrist and they had to be extirpated. The level of violent bitterness that apocalyptic gave rise to is, I think, of absolutely fundamental importance in Irish history, and actually has been ignored by Irish historians who, well, most historians see apocalyptic as a bit bizarre, outre, on the fringes. No. In Irish history in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, apocalyptic was part of the fundamental mindset of Irish Protestants.
And of course, the Desmond Rebellion is a very interesting case, because if you look at the standard narrative of that in Irish history, it's one of the early manifestations of the Green Flag, yes. And the English putting down the rebellion is just a low intensity operation, yeah. And it's seen as a counterinsurgency operation, which actually fails to get into what was going on there. Absolutely. The Desmond Rebellion can be seen as the beginning of faith and fatherland Irish Catholic nationalism, which was a very powerful force and gave birth eventually to 19th century Irish Catholic nationalism. And on the Protestant side, of course, the association of Catholicism with rebellion was a really important trope, a really important idea, because of course, in times of peace, it's very hard to treat your Catholic neighbour as if he's a scion of Antichrist, to shun him as if he has 666 on his forehead. But of course, Irish history is punctuated by times of war, by rebellions. And every time a rebellion happened, the Protestants reverted back to this apocalyptic mentality. 1641 is the obvious example, when the Catholics rose against the English in Ireland. The interpretation of that in all the contemporary pamphlets written by Irish and English Protestants was that this was a papist conspiracy fomented by Antichrist, and this was proof that you cannot tolerate Antichrist, that you have to extirpate the forces of Antichrist, you have to extirpate Catholicism. And of course, that means you're not just fighting a group of guerrillas or a group of terrorists, to use a modern phrase, you're actually fighting the unseen cosmic forces of evil. You literally are fighting the demons. It's an existential battle. And it's no coincidence that wherever you have extreme conflict of an ethnic or religious variety, you will also see apocalyptic as a very important and powerful driving force, as in modern 20th century America. Well, okay, you mentioned modern 20th century America, but I'd like to make a different point about the importance of studying apocalyptic and the importance of studying, of taking religion as an important force seriously in history, because apocalyptic tends to be studied by a minority of biblical scholars. It's a phenomenon that exists in texts back then. So apocalypticism in Second Temple Judaism or apocalypticism in early Christianity, it's generated a vast scholarly literature that's only read by a handful of specialists. Apocalypticism then has a small place in eschatology, in systematic theology. But what you're doing is you're saying, let's take apocalypticism and use it as a mental map for understanding what was going on in the 16th century, because if you understand that, you will then understand what's happening later. Absolutely spot on. It is the driving ideological force of Irish sectarianism, and for an astonishingly long time. Still in the 19th century, apocalyptic was incredibly powerful in Ireland, even in the 20th century. In 1988, the General Assembly of the Irish Presbyterian Church voted on whether or not to drop the article in the Westminster Confession that states that the Pope was that man of sin, Antichrist. And yes, they did vote to drop it, but the interesting thing is there was a sizable majority who wanted to keep it.
And in that same year, of course, 1988, when the Pope appeared before the European Parliament, Ian Paisley appeared at the same time to denounce, much to everyone's embarrassment, the Pope as Antichrist. It's still an incredibly powerful ideological force, even in the 20th century in Ireland.
I remember a psychologist once telling me that if you can name a problem, you're halfway towards being able to confront it. Perhaps in naming it, we've actually contributed towards being able to deal with it.
I hope so.
Thank you, Alan.